Helen Aldridge had always known exactly who she was. For 28 years, she had walked the hallways of Ridgemont High School with the posture of a woman who believed that discipline was love's highest expression, that order was the architecture of a meaningful life. She had retired 6 years ago, but the hallway still echoed inside her, the click of her heels on linoleum, the way students straightened when she rounded a corner. The quiet authority she carried like a second skeleton beneath her skin. She had built herself into something unmistakable, a woman of standards, a woman who could look at any room and know immediately what was wrong with it and how to fix it. Now she stood before her bedroom mirror and could not find that woman anywhere. The reflection showed someone she might have crossed the street to avoid a year ago. The grey jacket hung off her shoulders like a surrender flag, 2 sizes too large, pulled from the donation bin behind the Methodist Church on 5th Street. The pants had a tear at the knee she had widened with a pocket knife that morning. Sitting on the edge of the bathtub, working the blade through fabric with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime making things perfect and was now learning for the first time the craft of making things fall apart. The shoes had no laces. They had belonged to someone else, someone whose journey had ended at a donation bin, and Helen tried not to think about where that person was now. But it was her face that unsettled her most. 14 months ago, she had stood in the same spot and watched her hair come out in clumps, dark strands falling between her fingers like the last leaves of a tree that understood winter was no longer coming, but had already arrived. The chemotherapy had taken everything the cancer hadn't. Her elegant black hair, the hair she had swept into a twist every morning for 4 decades, was gone. What grew back was different. Short silver curling in directions she couldn't predict or control. She had lost 15 kilograms, her cheekbones pressed against skin that seemed to have forgotten how to hold its shape. Her hands trembled, a side effect. The oncologist said might fade, might not. The kind of uncertainty Helen had never tolerated in any other area of her life. She didn't need much of a disguise. The cancer had handled the transformation with a thoroughness she could almost admire if admiration was something she could feel right now. Instead of this cold, precise anger that had been building inside her, for 5 weeks accumulating like water behind a dam she was about to open, Martin emerged from the bathroom. Her husband of 43 years looked like a man auditioning for a role he didn't want. 3 weeks of unshaved beard covered the face she had kissed every morning since 1983, a face that had always been clean, composed the face of a man who taught music to teenagers and believed that Bach's cello suites could explain everything worth understanding about the human soul. He had lost weight too, 10 kilograms shed during the months he spent driving her to chemotherapy appointments, sitting in waiting rooms reading magazines. He never remembered making dinners. She couldn't eat, and then standing at the sink washing dishes with the careful repetitive motions of a man trying to hold himself together, one plate at a time. He wore a wool cap with a frayed brim pulled low over his forehead, a flannel shirt missing 2 buttons. Work pants stained with something that might have been motor oil or might have been paint. He looked like a stranger. He looked like someone the world had used up and set aside. And the worst part was that it wasn't entirely an act. Their eyes met in the mirror. 2 retired educators. 2 people who had spent their careers shaping young minds, who had raised 5 children, funded 4 college educations, co-signed 3 mortgages, written more checks than either of them could count. For graduations, weddings, first apartments, second cars, third chances. 2 people who had given everything they had and were about to find out whether any of it had purchased what they thought they were buying. Martin's voice was soft, almost apologetic, the way it always got when he was about to say something he knew she didn't want to hear. You look terrible. Helen managed something that wasn't quite a smile. So do you. They stood in the silence that 43 years of marriage creates, a silence that contains entire conversations, arguments settled and unsettled, promises kept and broken, the accumulated weight of 10,000 mornings waking up beside the same person and choosing again and again to stay. Martin reached for her hand. His fingers were warm. Hers were cold despite the September heat. and she wondered when that had started, when her body had begun retreating from its own extremities, pulling warmth inward, like a country withdrawing its armies to defend the capital. The canvas bag sat on the bed, packed with the efficiency of a woman who had organized school evacuations, field trips, and 5 children's worth of sports equipment for 2 decades. Inside, a change of clothes, sealed in a plastic bag, their medications hidden in an aspirin bottle, including the maintenance drugs she still took every morning. The small white pills that stood between her and the thing that had tried to kill her, $200 in emergency cash, and a small leather notebook with a pen clipped to its spine. The notebook was Helen's idea. She intended to record everything, every response, every expression, every closed door. She was a woman who believed in evidence, in documentation, in the power of written proof to make the intangible undeniable. Martin picked up the bag, tested its weight, set it down again. His jaw worked the way it did when he was choosing between several things to say and finding none of them adequate. Finally, he settled on the simplest version. "Are you sure about this?" Helen looked at him, really looked the way she had been unable to look at her own reflection, and saw the question beneath the question. He wasn't asking if she was sure about the plan. He was asking if she was sure she could survive what they might find. Her answer came from a place deeper than certainty, from the bedrock of a woman who had spent her entire adult life making decisions and living with their consequences. "I need to know, we need to know, and if the answer is what I'm afraid of." She picked up the bag and slung it over her shoulder with a firmness that ended the conversation. "Then at least we'll stop wondering why our phone only rings when one of them needs a cosign or a check." The plan had its origin 5 weeks earlier, but the seed had been planted long before that, in the slow accumulation of missed calls and rushed conversations of holidays that felt like obligations and birthdays that passed with text messages instead of visits. Helen had felt it growing for years, this sense that her children had become strangers who happened to share her last name satellites that had escaped her gravity and were now orbiting suns she couldn't see. But she had told herself it was normal. Children grow up, they build their own lives, they get busy. She had told herself this so many times it had become a kind of prayer. A liturgy of denial she recited every time another holiday passed, with an empty table and a phone that didn't ring. The seed cracked open on a Tuesday evening 5 weeks before the morning, in front of the mirror, when Helen was sitting in the study going through medical bills. The cancer was gone. Her oncologist had used the word remission, with the cautious optimism of a man who understood that the word meant for now. But the bills remained a paper monument to the 14 months she had spent fighting for her life. She was organizing them into folders, a task that soothed the part of her brain that needed everything categorized and controlled, when her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen. Catherine, her eldest, the cardiologist in Boston. Helen reached for the phone with the reflexive hope that had survived everything. The distance, the silence, the growing suspicion that her daughter called out of duty rather than desire. But her thumb hit the wrong spot on the screen, and instead of answering, she activated the speaker just as the call connected to what was clearly already an ongoing conversation. Catherine hadn't called her at all. Helen's phone had pocket-dialed into a conference call between Catherine and Philip, her second child, the corporate attorney in Chicago. She should have hung up. She knew that immediately, and with absolute clarity, the way she knew that eavesdropping was wrong, the way she knew that whatever she heard would change something that could never be changed back. But Catherine was saying her name, and the tone was not the tone of a daughter worried about her mother. It was the tone of a portfolio manager assessing an asset. Catherine's voice carried the clinical precision she had cultivated for delivering difficult diagnoses to patients' families, except now the patient was Helen, and the diagnosis was financial. "Mom and Dad aren't getting younger. Mom just went through cancer. We need to talk seriously about estate planning before something happens." Philip responded with the measured cadence of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where every word was recorded. "Agreed. The Connecticut house is worth at least 1.2 million in the current market, plus the investment portfolio, retirement accounts. The question is Ethan. Are they going to leave him anything? Because splitting 5 ways when he's living in that falling apart farmhouse seems like a waste. He married that woman who raises chickens. What would they even do with a real inheritance? Catherine laughed, a small dismissive sound that hit Helen's chest like a fist. She doesn't even have a degree. Can you imagine her managing a trust fund? They talked for 11 more minutes. Helen sat in the dark of her study and listened to her children discuss her, as if she were already dead, as if her life had already been converted into numbers on a spreadsheet, as if the only question remaining was how to divide the sum efficiently. They did not ask how she was feeling. They did not mention the cancer, except as a variable that accelerated their timeline. They did not say the word mother with anything resembling tenderness. When the call ended, Helen sat motionless for a long time. The medical bills lay in their folders, organized and labeled, a lifetime of meticulous control applied to the evidence of her own mortality. She thought about calling Catherine back, confronting her, demanding an explanation using the voice that had silenced auditoriums full of restless teenagers. But something stopped her. Not fear, something colder. The realization that confrontation would only produce performance-rehearsed apologies. Strategic tears, the kind of emotional theater her children had learned to produce on demand. She didn't want their performance. She wanted their truth. She took out the leather notebook, opened it to the first page, drew a line down the center. On the left side, she wrote 5 names. On the right side, she left space for what she was about to discover. 3 weeks later came the birthday. The 71st birthday she had expected to celebrate with her family, or at least with the version of family she still permitted herself to imagine on optimistic days. Martin called each child personally, his voice carrying the gentle formality of a man extending an invitation he already suspected would be declined. Catherine couldn't make it. A cardiology conference in San Diego, the kind of event that filled her calendar months in advance and conveniently prevented any engagement that didn't advance her career. She expressed regret with the smooth efficiency of someone declining a dinner reservation. Philip had a deposition that couldn't be moved. His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who wanted you to understand that his schedule was a force of nature, something beyond human control like weather or gravity. Diana, the middle child, married to Grant Lawton, a tech executive whose name appeared in magazine profiles with the regularity of a recurring character in a series Helen had stopped watching, had plans in Napa Valley that Grant had arranged weeks ago. Canceling was apparently impossible, a word Diana used with the conviction of someone who had never been asked to distinguish between impossible and inconvenient. Marcus IV, an investment banker in Seattle who had made his first million before 30 and his second before 35, was closing a deal that would determine the trajectory of his entire career. He had been determining the trajectory of his entire career for 15 years, and Helen had stopped believing that any single deal was as pivotal as he claimed. But she said nothing. Only Ethan said yes. Ethan, the youngest, the one Helen had spent 2 decades privately categorizing as the family's cautionary tale. The one who had dropped out of his business degree after 2 years and announced he was going to figure things out best. A phrase that had landed on Helen's ears like a declaration of surrender. Ethan, who had met a woman named Lila at a farmer's market and called home 3 weeks later to say he was getting married. And Helen had gripped the phone with both hands and told him he was making a mistake, that this woman was nobody, no degree, no career, no connections. And Ethan had listened in the silence he had perfected as a child, the silence of a boy who had learned that arguing with his mother was like arguing with architecture. He married Leela anyway. Helen refused to attend the wedding. Martin went alone and his toast was stiff and formal, the words of a man performing duty rather than celebrating joy. He left early, claiming a headache, and neither of them had visited the farmhouse since. That was 8 years ago. Ethan drove 90 miles through a thunderstorm in his 12-year-old truck that evening, arriving with mud on his boots and rain in his hair, and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than he could comfortably afford. Lila came with him carrying a box of biscuits she had baked from her grandmother's recipe, the kind of biscuits that required patience and a light touch, and ingredients that cost almost nothing. Ethan brought a handmade card. The front was a drawing not skilled but earnest of a sunrise over a field, and inside he had written in his careful, unhurried handwriting, "Happy birthday, Mom. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you made it through." Made it through. Meaning the cancer. Meaning the 14 months of treatments that had stripped her to her foundations and rebuilt her as someone she was still learning to recognize. Ethan had called every week during those 14 months. Every single week without exception, without prompting, without being asked. He called on Sunday evenings, and the conversations were never long, but they were always real. How was she feeling? Was Martin holding up? Did she need anything? Had the doctor said anything new? He never offered solutions or advice or the kind of aggressive optimism that healthy people sometimes impose on the sick like a tax. He just asked and listened and called again the following Sunday. The other 4 children had called a combined total of 3 times in 14 months. Catherine wants to recommend a specialist, a professional courtesy, the kind of referral she might have offered a colleague's mother. Philip once on Christmas, a call that lasted 4 minutes and included the sound of other people's laughter in the background. Diana sent a text, "Get well soon," followed by a heart emoji, the modern equivalent of a Hallmark card purchased at a gas station. Marcus didn't answer his phone for 3 weeks, and when he finally called, he asked about the house, whether they had considered selling while the market was strong, before asking about the diagnosis. That birthday night, after Ethan and Lila had driven home through the storm, after Helen had cleaned up the cake that only 4 people had touched, she sat in her study and opened the leather notebook. The names were already there from 5 weeks earlier, written the night she overheard the call. Now she filled in the right side of the page, not with plans. Those were already taking shape in the part of her mind that had organized 28 years of school operations, but with questions. Would Catherine look at her mother's face and see a stranger? Would Philip delegate even compassion to his staff? Would Diana choose comfort over conscience? Would Marcus threaten what he couldn't control? And Ethan, quiet, stubborn, gentle. Ethan, who had chosen a life she couldn't understand, and a woman she had refused to know. What would Ethan do when 2 people who looked like everything the world wanted to forget showed up at his door? Helen didn't cry that night. She had never been a woman who cried when there was work to be done. She picked up a pen and began writing the details of the plan. Her handwriting small and precise, the penmanship of a woman who had signed thousands of report cards and believed that legibility was a form of respect. They invented a story simple because the best lies are scaffolded with truth. They were Helen and Martin Ward, former factory workers, not a retired principal and music teacher. They had lost their home to medical bills after Martin's heart surgery. The details would be kept vague because desperate people rarely have the energy for elaborate explanations, and because Helen understood that the most convincing performances are the ones that leave room for the audience to fill in its own assumptions. They took a Greyhound bus because driving their own car would have shattered the illusion before it began. 12 hours from Connecticut to Boston, watching America scroll past grimy windows that hadn't been cleaned since the previous administration. The bus smelled of fast food and disinfectant, and the exhaustion of people who travel because they must rather than because they choose to. Helen sat upright the entire time, her spine refusing to surrender to the cheap seat, while Martin dozed beside her, his head bobbing with each pothole, his face in sleep, looking younger and more vulnerable than the disguise permitted. She watched him breathe and thought about their life together. 43 years. She had been the engine. He had been the compass. She pushed, he steered. She made the plans. He made them survivable. When she had insisted their children attend the best schools, he had found ways to make homework feel less like punishment. When she had mapped out career trajectories for each child before they finished elementary school, He had quietly left books on their nightstands, novels, poetry, biographies of people who had lived interesting lives rather than impressive ones. Breadcrumbs toward a different kind of ambition that she had noticed but never acknowledged. Martin had always been gentler than she was, less certain, more willing to ask questions without knowing the answers. She had mistaken that quality for weakness for most of their marriage. She was beginning to suspect it might have been the only form of strength that mattered. Catherine's neighborhood announced itself through increasingly surgical landscaping and gates that seemed designed less to keep people out than to remind everyone of the cost of getting in. The houses grew larger and further apart, separated by expanses of lawn that existed not for playing or gathering, but for establishing distance. Catherine's home, a restored Victorian, with a Tesla in the driveway, and a silence so complete it felt like the neighborhood had been built in a soundproofed room, sat on a tree-lined street where the quiet carried the weight of money that has learned to make no noise. They walked the final mile from the bus stop. By the time they reached Catherine's address, Helen's hip ached from the cheap bus seat, and Martin's back had locked into a position that required conscious effort to straighten. They looked exactly like what they were pretending to be. Exhausted, desperate, invisible. Helen found grim satisfaction in that the efficiency of the disguise, the way the world had already begun to look through them as they walked through Catherine's neighborhood. The joggers and dog walkers and landscaping crews, all performing the same smooth, practiced avoidance eyes, sliding away like water off treated glass. A housekeeper answered the door, middle-aged, kind-eyed, with an accent Helen couldn't place and didn't try to. Helen kept her voice humble, her gaze lowered, inhabiting the role with the discipline of someone who understood that performance was about commitment, not talent. "We've been traveling a long way. We're wondering if there might be food to spare or some work we could do in exchange for a meal." The housekeeper looked at them with genuine sympathy. The real thing unfiltered, unperformed. And something in Helen's chest tightened at the realization that a stranger's employee was already showing more human warmth than she expected from her own daughter. "Wait here, let me ask." 7 minutes. Helen counted each one. She had developed this habit during chemotherapy, counting minutes in waiting rooms, counting the drips of IV fluid, counting the ceiling tiles above the treatment chair. And it had followed her out of the hospital and into this new life where time had acquired a weight it never carried before. The door opened. Not the housekeeper. Catherine. Helen's pulse hammered against her ribs with a violence that frightened her. Her firstborn. The baby whose first steps she had filmed on a camcorder the size of a small suitcase. The girl who had lined up her dolls in perfect rows before she could read, who had made Helen promise to walk her down the aisle, not daddy you because you're the strongest person I know. Who had called at 2 in the morning, sobbing when her first patient died on the table, and Helen had stayed on the phone until dawn, saying nothing useful, just breathing alongside her daughter through the worst night of her career. Catherine stood in the doorway wearing a silk blouse that cost more than the bus tickets that had brought her parents to this porch. Her hair was perfect. Her posture was perfect. Everything about her was calibrated and controlled, and Helen recognized it because it was her own design. She had spent 2 decades sculpting her children into images of competence and achievement, and here was the masterpiece standing in her doorway looking at her mother and seeing nothing. Catherine's voice carried the polished warmth she had cultivated for delivering bad news to patients' families, empathetic enough to satisfy professional standards, detached enough to preserve emotional bandwidth. "I'm sorry, we don't give handouts. There's a shelter about 4 miles from here. They serve dinner at 6. Then she asked the question that almost changed everything. "Where are you folks from?" Helen answered just 2 words. The name of a town spoken in her own voice because she hadn't thought to change it. Because a voice is the last thing a person thinks to disguise, and Catherine tilted her head. Her eyes narrowed. Something flickered across her face like a signal fire on a distant hill visible for 1 second before the darkness swallowed it. Helen's voice. The cadence, the way she shaped certain vowels, the musicality that Martin always said she'd inherited from nobody, because both her parents had spoken in monotones. Catherine heard something. Helen could see it, the recognition trying to surface like a diver, running out of air, clawing upward through dark water toward light. But recognition requires willingness. It requires the observer to accept that the impossible might be standing on her porch, in stained clothing with no shoelaces. And Catherine had built her life on the principle that impossible things don't happen to people like her, that the world is orderly and predictable, and that mothers don't show up looking like refugees at their daughters' front doors. So the recognition drowned. Catherine's expression smoothed over like water closing above a stone, and she reached into her pocket and produced a $20 bill, extending it without making eye contact, the way you hand a receipt to a cashier whose name you will never learn. For bus fare. Martin made a small sound beside her, a catch in his breath. A syllable that might have been the beginning of Catherine before Helen's hand found his and squeezed hard, a warning compressed into 5 fingers. Helen took the 20. Thank you. God bless you. Catherine was already turning away, her body pivoting with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to end conversations with patients' families without appearing cruel. Rosa, make sure they leave the property before you lock up. The door clicked shut. The sound was small and absolute, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been 47 years in the writing. They stood on the porch for a span of time that Helen's counting habit could not quantify because the numbers had stopped making sense. Then she guided Martin down the steps and along the walkway, and through the gate and back to the sidewalk, her hand steady on his arm, feeling the tremor running through him like a current through water. 3 blocks away, they found a park bench screened by hedges. Martin's shoulders shook. His crying was silent, which made it worse, the sound of a man who had learned over decades of marriage to a woman who valued composure to grieve without making noise. Helen opened the notebook. Her pen moved with the same precision she had applied to 28 years of administrative reports, performance reviews, disciplinary files. She wrote, Catherine, 7 minutes, $20. Almost recognized my voice but talked herself out of it. Easier that way, isn't it, Catherine? Easier than recognizing your mother standing on your porch. She drew a single line through Catherine's name. Not a cross that would come later if it needed to. Just a line. An accounting mark. A record of what had been tested and found wanting. Martin wiped his face with the back of his hand. We could stop. We don't have to do this. Helen looked at the $20 bill. Her daughter's price for making 2 old people vanish from her doorstep, and folded it into the notebook between the pages, like a bookmark for a chapter she never wanted to read again. We've come this far. I need to know if Catherine is all of them. The bus to Chicago left at 6 the next morning. Another 12 hours of diesel fumes and rest-stop coffee and the loneliness of traveling through a country that was designed for people moving faster than they were moving. Helen's hip had stiffened overnight from sleeping on a shelter cot that smelled of industrial detergent and the compressed sorrow of everyone who had slept on it before her. Martin's back had graduated from aching to a persistent low-grade hostility that made every seated position feel like a negotiation with his own skeleton. Phillips Building pierced the Chicago skyline with the architectural confidence of a structure that had nothing to prove and knew it. Steel and glass, 40 stories of reflective surfaces that turned the surrounding neighborhood into a funhouse mirror, distorting the modest brick buildings and family restaurants into stretched, unrecognizable versions of themselves. Philip lived in the penthouse, a word that Helen had once associated with accomplishment, and now understood as a synonym for altitude, for the distance a person puts between themselves and the ground where ordinary people walk. The penthouse meant security protocols, key cards, intercoms, a doorman stationed at the entrance like a checkpoint between worlds. A young man with forearms that suggested either dedicated gym time or a previous career involving physical confrontation, and eyes that had catalogued every variation of human desperation that had ever approached his post. They never got inside the building. Building residents only. The doorman's voice carried no malice, only the flat certainty of a man whose job was to sort people into categories, those who belonged and those who didn't, and who had already completed his assessment before Helen finished her first sentence. "We're trying to reach someone on the top floor, Philip Aldridge. We once knew his parents. We're hoping he might help us." The doorman's expression didn't change. "Mr. Aldridge doesn't accept visitors without an appointment. If you'd like to leave a message, I can see it gets to his assistant." Helen thought of Philip at 12 years old, burrowed under his blankets during thunderstorms, his flashlight making a tent of the sheets while she sat on the edge of his bed and told him that thunder was just the sky clearing its throat. Philip, who had begged for a dog every Christmas until they finally caved and brought home a golden retriever named Scout. Philip, who had delivered the eulogy at his grandmother's funeral with such quiet eloquence that the minister had pulled Helen aside afterward and whispered with something like awe that her son had a gift with words. Her words now were careful, deliberate, each one placed like a stone in a path she was building toward her son's conscience. "Could you tell him, please, that two people who once loved him very much are outside and need help?" Something shifted in the doorman's face, not sympathy exactly, but the professional discomfort of a man being asked to relay a message that exceeded his job description. He made the call. Helen watched him speak into the phone, watched him glance back at them, watched his expression rearrange itself into something that looked like embarrassment on behalf of someone who would never feel it himself. "Mr. Aldridge says he doesn't know anyone matching your description. He suggests I direct you to the city's homeless services hotline." A card, pre-printed, a phone number and an address, and the hours of operation of warmth available to people who had been sorted into the category of not belonging. Helen tried once more, because she was a woman who had never accepted a first rejection as final, who had built a career on the principle that persistence was not the same as stubbornness, that trying again was not the same as refusing to listen. "Please call again. Tell him that two people who once loved him very much are standing outside and they need help." The doorman's eyes held hers for a beat longer than protocol required. Then he dialed again. This time the conversation was shorter. When he hung up, his voice carried the gentleness of someone delivering a verdict he didn't agree with, but wasn't paid to challenge. "Mr. Aldridge asked that you contact the hotline, and he's asked security to ensure the lobby remains clear." Security. Her son had sent security to remove his mother from his building. The boy who couldn't sleep without Scout curled at the foot of his bed, who had written in his college application essay that his mother was the strongest person he had ever known, had dispatched a guard to make her disappear. Martin's hand found hers. His grip was tight enough to hurt, and she let it hurt, because pain was something she understood, something with clear edges and a beginning and an end, unlike the thing expanding in her chest that had no shape and no name and no boundary. They walked to Millennium Park. The being, that massive silver sculpture, reflected the city in its curved surface, and Helen remembered standing here 15 years ago with all 5 of her children, everyone smiling. Martin holding the camera, Catherine lifting Ethan onto her shoulders so he could see his reflection in the polished steel. They had been a family that day, or they had looked like one, which she was beginning to understand might not be the same thing. Tourists swirled around them. Selfies were taken. Laughter erupted and faded. No one stopped. No one looked. They had become part of the landscape, 2 more figures on a bench, as ignorable as pigeons, as invisible as the homeless always are in spaces designed for people who can afford to look at art instead of survival. Helen opened her notebook and wrote, "Philip, 0 contact, everything through intermediaries, sent security to remove his mother. The boy who was afraid of thunder until he was 12. The boy who eulogized his grandmother so beautifully, the minister called it a gift. The boy who wrote in his college essay that I was the strongest person he knew. he wouldn't even come downstairs. She drew a line through Philip's name. Martin sat beside her, his tears finished now replaced by something quieter and more dangerous. A stillness that Helen recognized from 43 years of reading this man. The stillness that meant he was reassessing something fundamental about the world and finding the new version harder to inhabit than the old one. Helen closed the notebook. The anger she had carried since the overheard phone call was changing, metabolizing into something more corrosive and harder to contain. Not fury at her children that was too simple, too clean, too much like the righteous indignation she had wielded as a principal when a student misbehaved. This was different. This was the anger of a woman who was beginning to suspect that she was looking at her own reflection in her children's coldness, that the indifference she had encountered in Boston and Chicago was not a betrayal of her teaching, but its finest product. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was flat, stripped of performance, stripped of the authority she had carried for decades, stripped down to the bare frequency of a woman confronting the possibility that she had failed at the only thing she ever truly cared about. Two down. If all four are like this, then it's not them who failed, Martin. It's us. We failed. We taught them to be this way. We gave them everything except the one thing that mattered. Martin, his voice barely above the sound of pigeons. What's that? Helen watched a young couple take a selfie in front of the bean, their faces distorted in the curved steel, smiling at versions of themselves that didn't exist. How to see people. Palo Alto was too far for buses and beyond the reach of their dwindling cash. Helen had calculated this on the back of a napkin at the Chicago shelter, her pen moving through numbers with the grim efficiency of a woman who had balanced school budgets for 3 decades and knew exactly what it looked like when the math stopped working. They had $140 left after bus fare and the cheapest food they could find. Gas station coffee vending machine crackers, a sleeve of peanut butter cookies that Martin ate with the joyless determination of a man fueling a machine rather than feeding a body. California might as well have been another continent. Then Helen spotted the rideshare posting on a corkboard at the Greyhound station pinned between a missing cat flyer and an advertisement for a faith-based recovery program. A handwritten index card. Driving to SF, need gas money. Leaving Thursday, AM call Mara. A phone number in purple ink, the sevens crossed. In a European style, the handwriting of someone young enough to still believe that personality could be expressed through penmanship. Mara was 23. She drove a Honda Civic that smelled like patchouli and French fries, its backseat occupied by a duffel bag, a guitar case, and a box of books she was transporting to a friend who was starting a lending library in the Mission District. She had multicolored braids and a nose ring, and a way of looking at people directly without apology or agenda that Helen found simultaneously disarming and exhausting. Within the first hour of driving, Mara had asked more questions than Catherine had asked in 5 years. Her eyes found them in the rearview mirror, curious and unembarrassed. So where are you headed, really? And don't say you're just wandering. Nobody your age wanders without a destination. Martin glanced at Helen. Helen looked at this girl, this stranger, with her purple ink and her lending library books and her absolute refusal to accept a surface-level answer, and found herself talking. Not the full truth, but enough of its skeleton to give it shape. 5 children, success and distance. A trip designed to answer a question that had been eating at them for years. Mara drove in silence for a long time after Helen finished the highway unspooling beneath them, like a ribbon being pulled from a spool, mile markers ticking past with the regularity of a metronome. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who has earned their philosophy through loss rather than study. My grandma raised me after my mom couldn't. Never had much, but she gave me everything that mattered. When she got sick last year, I moved back home for 6 months to take care of her. Lost my job, almost lost my apartment. A shrug, the gesture of someone who has weighed the cost and found it acceptable. Worth it though, some things you don't put a price on. They drove through the Central Valley in comfortable silence after that past almond orchards and cattle ranches, and the occasional small town that appeared and vanished, like a thought that didn't quite finish forming. When Mara dropped them at a bus stop 30 miles from Palo Alto, she refused their gas money with a firmness that reminded Helen painfully of the woman she used to be before she learned to calculate every transaction. You need it more than I do, and whatever you find at the end of this trip, I hope it's worth the journey. Helen watched the Honda disappear down the highway and opened her notebook. She wrote, Mara, 23 years old, stranger, kinder than 4 of my children combined. Then she closed the notebook and put it in the bag and began walking toward Diana's neighborhood, where the houses were designed to be photographed rather than lived in. Diana's home was an architectural statement, all angles and glass and deliberate asymmetry. The kind of house that communicated its owner's taste so aggressively it left no room for warmth. Helen had seen it in a magazine once in a dentist's waiting room and had felt a pulse of pride that had now curdled into something closer to nausea. A pool stretched behind the house, turquoise and geometric, its surface so still it looked like a panel of colored glass set into the earth. The landscaping was sculptural. Even the mailbox looked curated. Grant Lawton answered the door. Diana's husband. Helen had met him at the wedding, and 3 times since, enough to form an opinion she had kept to herself because Diana seemed happy, or at least seemed to have achieved the configuration of comfort and status that their family had always confused with happiness. Grant had teeth that were too white, and a handshake that was too firm, and a way of steering every conversation toward his own accomplishments that suggested he experienced other people primarily as audiences. He didn't recognize his mother-in-law, the woman who had stood in his kitchen 6 years ago and asked pointed questions about his stock options. Over Thanksgiving dinner was now invisible to him, filtered out by the stained jacket and the absence of shoelaces, sorted into a category of person whose existence his neighborhood had been specifically engineered to prevent. His body was already blocking the doorway. Weight shifted to the closing side. Can I help you? Helen delivered the same request, food, water, anything to spare. Grant's expression performed a rapid sequence assessment, categorization, dismissal. He called over his shoulder for Diana. She appeared behind him, and Helen's chest compressed around her heart like a hand squeezing a stone. Her middle child. The girl who had been afraid of the dark until she was 14, who had made Helen check under her bed every single night and leave the hallway light on, who had written a letter when she graduated college. Helen still had it folded in the drawer of her nightstand that read, Everything I am, I learned from watching you. Diana was wearing yoga clothes that cost more than Mara's monthly rent. Her hair fell in the kind of effortless waves that required significant effort and expense to produce. Her nails were a shade of neutral that somehow communicated both taste and indifference simultaneously. She addressed Grant, not them. What do they want? Grant explained. Diana sighed, the exhaled breath of inconvenience, the sound of a woman whose primary relationship with discomfort was the effort required to remove it from her line of sight. Grant, we've talked about this, the neighborhood watch group specifically said. Helen watched her daughter's mouth form these words and thought about the girl who used to run to her with scraped knees, certain that her mother's kiss contained actual medicine, that Helen's lips on a wound could reverse biology through sheer maternal authority. Martin spoke up, his voice carrying something Helen couldn't access. A gentleness that survived even this. We're sorry to bother you. We'll go. And then it happened. Diana looked at Helen. Not the glancing assessment she had given before. This was something else, something deeper and more dangerous. 5 seconds. Her eyes moved across Helen's face the way a hand moves across a surface in the dark, searching for something familiar in unfamiliar terrain. Helen's posture, her spine which refused to curve even under exhaustion, the way she tilted her chin when she was waiting for a response, habits so deeply embedded they had survived cancer and chemotherapy and a week of sleeping in shelters. Diana saw something, a signal flare firing in a fog she couldn't navigate. Grant's voice cut through whatever was forming in his wife's mind. Diana, the door. The flare died. Diana blinked, and the recognition, if that's what it was, retreated behind the smooth curated surface she had spent her adult life constructing. She disappeared and returned with a reusable shopping bag containing 2 bottles of water and sandwiches wrapped in paper towels. These are from a catering event. They were going to be thrown out anyway. She extended the bag to Helen, careful not to let their fingers touch the universal gesture of charity, without contact of giving, without connection of generosity that costs nothing, because it was already waste. Helen took the bag. Martin whispered his thanks, his voice thick with tears he would shed later in private where Diana couldn't see them and wouldn't have noticed if she could. Diana pointed East Motel with day rate soup kitchen downtown. The professional smile, the one Helen had seen in photographs from charity galas, the one that communicated benevolence without requiring its practitioner to feel anything at all. Good luck. The door began to close. But Helen stood still for 3 seconds longer than Martin, her feet planted on the welcome mat that said, "Bless this mess," in cheerful script. And through the narrowing gap she heard Diana's voice. There was something about that woman. Her voice, the way she, "Grant you're imagining things, close the door." The lock engaged. Helen wrote in the notebook, standing at the bus stop eating sandwiches her daughter had almost thrown in the trash. Diana, 5 seconds. Her instinct nearly won. But Grant was faster, and Diana has spent her whole life letting other people's certainty overrule her own doubt. She drew the line through the third name. Seattle took everything they had left. By the time the bus groaned into the station, 5 days had passed since they left Connecticut. 2 nights in bus stations, one in the Chicago shelter, another in a roadside rest stop where Helen had slept sitting upright on a concrete bench, while Martin kept watch and the interstate hummed its mechanical lullaby. Her cough had started in California, a dry rasp she attributed to the bus exhaust, then to the autumn air, then to nothing at all. Because admitting its real source would require admitting that her lungs, weakened by chemotherapy, were losing a fight she couldn't afford to acknowledge. The maintenance medication she took every morning was designed for a woman who slept in a bed and ate regular meals and kept stress at manageable levels, not for a woman riding Greyhound buses across 3 time zones, while her body quietly converted exhaustion into illness. Marcus's neighborhood had undergone the transformation that American cities perform on their poorest districts. The alchemy of displacement, where breweries and boutiques colonize buildings that once held laundromats and check-cashing stores, where young people with large dreams pay enormous rents for spaces smaller than the closets in their parents' suburban homes, and where the previous residents simply vanish, absorbed into the margins of a city that no longer has room for people who can't afford cold brew coffee. 4th floor. No doorman this time, just a buzzer system, a grid of names and buttons. The building's residents reduced to labels beside electronic switches. Helen pressed the button next to her son's name. The intercom crackled with the distorted voice of a man she had nursed through chicken pox and helped with algebra homework and driven to soccer practice every Saturday for 6 years. "Yeah, we're looking for help, food, or wrong apartment." Dead air. She pressed again. Silence. A third time. Martin leaned toward the speaker, his voice carrying the kind of quiet plea that Helen could never produce because her vocal cords had been trained for authority, not supplication. "We've come such a long way, we just need—" Marcus's voice hit the intercom like a door slamming. "Lady, I don't know how you got into the building, but I'm not opening my door for strangers. There's a shelter on Pine Street. Go there. If you press that buzzer one more time, I'm calling the cops." The intercom went dead with a finality that felt biological, like the cessation of a heartbeat. They stood in the hallway for several minutes. Helen wasn't counting anymore because counting required a faith in the meaningfulness of numbers that she could no longer sustain. The fluorescent light above them buzzed with the sound of electricity being converted into the cheapest possible illumination, and in that harsh, shadowless glare, They looked exactly like what they had become, two people who had crossed a country to find their children and discovered that their children had crossed something too, some invisible boundary between obligation and indifference that could not be recrossed by buzzer or plea or the memory of chicken pox and algebra and 6 years of Saturday soccer. Helen opened her notebook for the last time on this journey. Her handwriting had changed over the 5 days. The small, precise letters of the retired principal had loosened, grown uneven, begun to lean in directions they hadn't leaned before, as though even her penmanship was losing its ability to maintain the posture she had demanded of it for decades. She wrote, Marcus threatened to call the police on his mother, the child who cried when he lost at Monopoly until he was 15. Now he would have police arrest a 71-year-old woman who just finished chemotherapy. She closed the notebook. She did not draw a line through Marcus's name. There was no need. The page spoke for itself. Outside Seattle drizzled its perpetual gray mist onto sidewalks that reflected the city's lights like oil on water. Helen stood under an awning and looked at Martin. And what she said next came from a place she had never accessed before, below the authority, below the planning, below the decades of certainty that had carried her through a career and a marriage and a diagnosis and 5 days of closed doors. For now, I want to go home. Martin, rain beading on the brim of his wool cap. There's still Ethan. Helen's voice dropped to a frequency that was almost inaudible, a confession spoken at the volume of prayer. I'm afraid that he'll turn us away too. She shook her head, and the motion seemed to cost her something essential, some last reserve of the composure that had defined her for 7 decades. I'm afraid he won't. I'm afraid the child I dismissed is the only one worth anything. Because then I'll have to face what I did to him for 8 years. I didn't go to my own son's wedding, Martin. I rejected his wife without giving her a single chance. If Ethan opens that door, then the question isn't who failed us, it's who we failed. And I already know the answer. The bus toward Millbrook left at dawn. The last bus, the last name. 7 miles of unpaved road from the crossroads where the Greyhound deposited them like cargo that had reached the end of its shipping label's jurisdiction. A faded sign pointed toward a town in one direction and farmland in the other, and the sky hung low and undecided, threatening rain without committing to it. Helen's cough had deepened overnight into something that rattled in her chest when she breathed a sound like small stones being shaken in a paper bag. Martin helped her down the bus steps, and she let him, which frightened him more than anything else on this trip, because Helen Aldridge did not let people help her. She organized help. She dispatched help. She evaluated the efficiency of help. She did not receive it. 3 miles of dirt road bordered by harvested cornfields. The stubble standing in rows like the aftermath of something orderly that had been cut down and carried away. A tractor hummed somewhere beyond the tree line, the sound of a life measured in planting and harvest rather than quarterly earnings and performance reviews. The farmhouse appeared as they crested a low hill, and Helen stopped walking. White clapboard siding, 2 stories wraparound porch. The paint was peeling. The roof had been patched rather than replaced. She could see the newer shingles overlapping the old ones, a repair made by someone working with limited resources and unlimited determination. But there were flower boxes beneath every window bursting with late-season color. A garden stretched behind the house in organized rows, still producing despite the turning season. A tire swing hung from an oak in the front yard, and scattered across the grass a tricycle, a ball, a small red wagon filled with pine cones. Children's toys, grandchildren. Helen had grandchildren she had never met, had never held, had never sung to sleep or taught to count or taken to the park. They existed in this farmhouse 90 miles from her front door, and she had not known because she had not asked. And she had not asked because she had decided 8 years ago that this life, this modest, quiet, deliberately small life was beneath the family she had built. Martin whispered beside her, "He never told us." The words left Helen before she could stop them, before the censor that had governed her speech for 50 years could catch and redirect them. Would we have listened? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They approached the front gate, a simple wooden latch that stuck, and Helen was still fumbling with it when the front door opened and a child stepped onto the porch. A girl 4 years old with wild brown curls and eyes that belonged to Ethan. The same shade, the same shape, the same quality of looking at the world, as though every object in it deserved careful individual attention. She wore overalls with a dirt smudge on one knee and carried a stuffed rabbit whose fur had been loved into patches of bare fabric. She regarded them with the fearless curiosity that only the very young possess, the curiosity that has not yet learned to be afraid of strangers or to sort people into categories of worthy and unworthy. Are you lost? Helen's throat locked. This was her granddaughter, her blood, and the child looked at her with no recognition, because recognition requires a history they did not share. Martin managed what Helen couldn't. We're looking for the people who live here. The girl considered this with the seriousness of someone being asked to solve an important problem. Mommy's inside. She's making soup. A tilt of the head, a frank assessment delivered without malice. You look tired and kind of dirty. Rosie. A woman's voice from inside. Who are you talking to? Footsteps across a wooden floor. And then Lila appeared in the doorway. Helen had met her twice at the wedding she had refused to attend, and therefore knew only through Martin's second-hand account, and once at a family gathering so tense, it had guaranteed there would be no further invitations. Her memory of Lila was a sketch, not a portrait, a quiet woman plainly dressed, who seemed to shrink in the presence of her in-laws' expectations and her siblings-in-law's accomplishments. A woman Helen had dismissed with the efficiency of someone sorting mail, assessed, categorized, discarded. The woman in the doorway bore no resemblance to that sketch. Lila wore jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and an apron dusted with flour, and every line of her body communicated a calm, grounded authority that Helen recognized because she had spent her life cultivating her own version of it. But where Helen's authority had been built on position and performance, Lila's appeared to grow from something simpler and more durable, the unshakable confidence of a woman who knew exactly where she stood and why. Lila looked at them. Two strangers in filthy clothes, exhaustion etched into their faces like something carved rather than worn. Her expression shifted in a single beat from curiosity to concern. Not the performed concern of Catherine's professional empathy, not the calculated concern of someone weighing the cost of engagement, but the immediate reflexive concern of a person who sees suffering and moves toward it the way water moves downhill, without deliberation, without calculation, because the gradient of her character permitted no other direction. Oh my goodness, are you all right? Come in, come in. Rosie, go tell Daddy we have guests. She unlatched the gate herself and reached for Martin's arm, supporting him up the porch steps, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to helping bodies that couldn't fully help themselves. When did you last eat? When did you last rest properly? You look like you've been walking for days. Helen cracked. The composure that had survived Boston and Chicago and Palo Alto and Seattle, that had survived 4 closed doors and a $20 bill, and a security guard and leftover sandwiches and a threat to call the police. The composure that had been her armor for 71 years. Her inheritance from a childhood where showing weakness was the same as inviting it cracked along a fault line she hadn't known existed. And what came through the crack was not the controlled grief of a woman managing her emotions, but the raw, unfiltered weeping of someone who has walked to the end of everything she believed and found it empty. I'm sorry, we don't mean to intrude. We just... Lila's hand was on her arm, warm, steady, present. Hush. You're not intruding. You're exactly where you need to be. Come inside. I've got soup on the stove and bread in the oven and a warm fire in the living room. She guided them through the front door without asking who they were or where they'd come from, without pausing, without the flicker of hesitation that Helen had seen in 4 doorways across 4 cities, the micro-expression of calculation that preceded every rejection. Lila simply opened her door the way a lung opens for air. because that is what it was designed to do. Inside, worn floors covered with braided rugs. Furniture that had been handed down rather than purchased, each piece carrying the warmth of objects that have been useful to multiple generations. Books stacked on every surface, shelves, end tables, windowsills, the overflow of a household that consumed stories the way other households consume television. Children's artwork taped to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like farm animals. A fire in a stone hearth. The smell of soup made from scratch bread baking wood smoke. The smell of a home that was not performing the idea of comfort, but simply producing it organically and without effort. The way a garden produces vegetables because the conditions were right and the care was consistent. Leela settled them on the couch near the fire and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with 2 mugs. Tea with honey, it'll help with that cough. Her eyes rested on Helen with the diagnostic attention of someone who recognized illness by its sound rather than its documentation. You need to see a doctor, that settled in your chest. Helen started to protest, the reflex of a woman who had spent her life solving problems rather than being one. But Lila was already in motion, already past the point where protest could redirect her. Let's worry about that later. Right now you need warmth and food and rest. Everything else can wait. Rosie had returned and was studying them from the doorway with the fixed attention of a naturalist observing a new species. She climbed onto the couch beside Helen and held out the stuffed rabbit with the ceremonial gravity of someone presenting a diplomatic gift. You can hold Mr. Buttons. He makes me feel better when I'm sad. Helen took the rabbit. Her hands shook. The stuffing was lumpy and one ear was longer than the other, and the fur was worn thin in places, and it was the most valuable thing anyone had given her since Ethan's birthday card. Thank you, sweetheart. What's your name? Rosie. What's yours? Helen. The child's face brightened with the delight of a coincidence she considered personally significant. Those are nice names. My grandma's name is Helen, too, but Mommy says she lives far away and doesn't visit. The words were innocent. Rosie delivered them the way children deliver all devastating truths, without awareness of their weight, without understanding that some sentences land not as information, but as verdict. Helen felt the impact in her sternum, a physical blow delivered by a 4-year-old who was simply reporting the facts of her world as she understood them. Her arms tightened around the rabbit. Lila had noticed. Her eyes moved between Rosie and Helen, and something crossed her face, not suspicion, not recognition, but the focused attention of a woman filing away a data point whose significance she had not yet determined. Rosie, why don't you go help Daddy in the workshop? Tell him dinner will be ready soon. The child obeyed reluctantly, casting glances over her shoulder as she went. When the door closed behind her, Lila looked at Helen for a long, quiet moment. Then she spoke with the gentleness of someone who has decided to set aside her questions in favor of someone else's needs. The bathroom is upstairs, first door on the left. Clean towels in the cabinet, soap in the dish. Take as long as you need. I'll find some clothes that might fit. We can't. You can, and you will. Whatever brought you to my door, whatever you've been through right now, you're my guests. And in this house, we take care of our guests. Ethan walked in at dinner, taller than Helen remembered, or maybe he simply carried himself differently now. The loose, unhurried posture of a man whose daily work involved lifting and carrying and bending, whose body had been shaped by function rather than aesthetics. His hands were calloused. His face was weathered. His eyes were the same kind, earnest, attentive. And when they settled on Helen, sitting at his kitchen table in borrowed clothes, eating his wife's soup, they lingered with the focus of a man trying to place something familiar in an unfamiliar context. He didn't find it. His mother had been a woman of sharp angles and controlled elegance. The thin, silver-haired stranger at his table, softened by exhaustion and illness. And 5 days of stripped-away pretense bore no resemblance to the principal who had never left the house without pressed clothes and polished shoes. His handshake was warm. No performance in it, no competition. Just the honest grip of a man who meant what his hand was saying. Nice to meet you. I'm Ethan. Welcome to our home. During the days that followed, Helen inhabited a life she had spent 8 years dismissing. She learned to harvest tomatoes, feeling for the gift that distinguished ripe from almost ripe her fingers, acquiring a sensitivity she hadn't known they possessed. She learned that Lila's grandmother had a saying for everything, and that most of them were right. She learned that her granddaughter believed every story needed a dragon, and that her 2-year-old grandson Sam had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and a laugh that sounded like something being healed. Martin worked alongside Ethan, mending fences and clearing brush. They spoke little at first. The silence between them filled with the ring of hammers and the rasp of handsaws. But on the second afternoon, while they replaced a rotten fence post, Ethan began talking not to Martin specifically, but to the work the way men sometimes do when the thing they need to say is too large to aim at another person. When I was in college studying business like my father wanted, I used to have nightmares. I was in a building made of glass and everyone around me was shouting numbers and I was trying to find a door but there weren't any, just glass walls going up forever. He tamped the earth around the new post with the flat of a shovel. Then I came out here one summer to help a friend fix up his grandmother's barn. First night, I slept better than I had in years. Met Leela at the farmer's market that same week. She was selling tomatoes. I bought 12 pounds just to keep talking to her. A faint smile. Made a lot of sauce that summer. The smile faded. My family thinks I failed because I didn't follow the path they laid out. But I didn't fail. I just chose differently. I chose this garden, this house, this woman who sees the world the way I do. I chose to measure my life in moments with my kids instead of meetings with clients. Helen heard every word from behind the tomato plants. Her hands frozen around a vine, her breath shallow with the effort of remaining silent, while her son described with unintentional precision the cost of everything she had valued and the value of everything she had overlooked. On the third day, Leela figured it out, not from Helen's face or voice, from her hands. Helen had placed dishes on the table face down, a habit so deeply embedded she didn't know she was doing it. A habit she had drilled into her children when they were young, because she believed it kept dust out of the bowls. Ethan had mentioned this to Lila years ago, a small detail from a childhood full of small rules. And when Rosie asked Helen for a bedtime story, Helen told the one about the princess in the tower, not trapped, just watching the stars, and a farmer who came not to rescue her, but to share his lunch, because he thought she looked hungry. Ethan had told Leela that his mother used to tell him that story every night. The same details. Lunch, not dinner. A farmer, not a prince. The same story passed from a mother to a son to his wife, and now back to the mother through a grandchild she hadn't known existed. Leela went into the kitchen. She stood at the sink, both hands gripping the edge of the counter, breathing with the deliberate rhythm of someone managing a feeling too large for the space it occupied. Then she dried her hands, picked up a bowl of soup, and carried it to the woman she now knew was her mother-in-law, the woman who had refused to come to her wedding, the woman who had looked at her 8 years ago and seen nothing worth knowing. She did not say a word. Because Helen was sick. The cough had worsened, deep rattling, the kind of cough that announces itself as a resident rather than a visitor. Lila understood priorities. She understood that confrontation and fever could not coexist, that truth and pneumonia were competing claims on a body that could not afford to fight both. She would deal with the illness first. The truth could wait. The truth had been waiting 8 years. A few more days would not change its shape. On the fourth day, Lila told Ethan. They stood in the barn with the leaking roof. The barn whose patched shingles Helen had noticed on her first approach, and Lila spoke quietly, her words precise. The woman in our house is your mother. Ethan didn't move for a long time. Then, how long have you known? Since yesterday. The dishes, the story about the princess. Why didn't you tell me? Because she's sick, and because I wanted to see if she would tell us herself. Ethan picked up a nail from the workbench, examined it, set it down. His jaw worked the way his father's did. The same muscle, the same motion. The same war between what a man wants to say and what he can bring himself to speak. What do we do? Lila's hand found his arm. The touch of a woman who had spent 8 years as the quiet center of a family that the larger family refused to acknowledge. We do what we always do. We take care of the people in our house, and we wait. Dr. Harmon arrived on day 5, a weathered man in his 60s with a black medical bag that looked like it had survived several presidencies, and a bedside manner built from decades of treating people who couldn't always pay in currency. He listened to Helen's chest, checked her temperature, asked his questions with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom diagnosis was as natural as breathing. Walking pneumonia. Not severe yet, but her lungs were compromised. The chemotherapy had left them vulnerable, and 5 days of bus stations and shelter cots and insufficient nutrition had provided exactly the conditions the infection needed. Antibiotics. Bed rest 1 week minimum. Lila told Helen she was staying, not asked, told. My grandmother died of pneumonia because she was too proud to let anyone help her. I made a promise that would never happen to anyone under my roof. So Helen stayed. And Lila cared for her with the same unhesitating competence she brought to everything soup at regular intervals, tea with honey books, read aloud in the afternoon, mustard plasters applied to Helen's chest, with the confidence of a woman drawing on generations of practical medicine. She taught Rosie to play quietly so Miss Helen could sleep. She changed the sheets without being asked. She opened windows for air and closed them against chill, and monitored the fever with the attentiveness of someone for whom caring was not a task but a vocation. One evening, Helen's voice rough but stronger than it had been. Do you ever resent us, Ethan's family, I mean, for not accepting you? Lila was quiet for a moment, sealing a jar of preserved tomatoes with hands that never stopped working, even when her mind was somewhere else entirely. I used to, when we first got married, and his mother refused to come to the wedding. I cried for 3 days, couldn't understand how a mother could do that to her own son. And now I feel sorry for them. Lila's voice carried no bitterness, only the steady clarity of a woman who had processed her grief and emerged on the other side of it with her capacity for compassion, not just intact but enlarged. They're missing everything. Rosie asks about her grandparents, why they never visit, why they don't call on her birthday. And I don't know what to tell her. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that some people value status over love? Helen closed her eyes. The tears came silently slipping from beneath her lids and tracking down her temples into the pillow. That night, Helen told Martine, tomorrow, we tell them tomorrow. But tomorrow came with a sky full of plans that weren't theirs. Martin, restless and wanting to be useful, offered to help Ethan with the barn roof, the leaking section, that had been visible since their first day. The patch shingles that represented everything this family did with limited resources and unlimited will. Ethan warned him to stay on the lower rungs to hand up tools rather than climb. But Martin saw the rotted board near the edge, the one Ethan would have to stretch to reach. And some combination of fatherly instinct and guilt propelled him upward, the need to help, to contribute, to prove that he could still be useful to the son he had spent 8 years ignoring. The board gave way beneath his weight, with the sound of something that had been holding on for too long finally letting go. Martin's foot went through. His body followed. Ethan lunged, and in the space between thought and action, in the gap where training and instinct live, the word that left his mouth was not Martin or Sir or Mister. It was Dad. The sound split the afternoon like an axe through kindling. Martin hit the ground, his left arm folded beneath him at an angle that arms are not designed to fold. Ethan was beside him in seconds, his hands finding his father's shoulders, his face white beneath the tan. Helen came running from the kitchen, the screen door banging behind her, and the name she screamed across the yard was not Mrs. Ward or any other fiction they had constructed. It was Martin, raw, terrified, the voice of a woman calling for the man she had loved for 43 years, stripped of every disguise, every pretense, every carefully constructed layer of deception. 3 seconds. That was all it took. Every mask, every false name, every lie they had carried across 4 cities and 1,000 miles of American highway. All of it fell away in 3 seconds of panic, leaving nothing but the truth standing in the farmyard in the autumn light, exposed and undeniable, and too late to take back. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent light, and the institutional calm that exists to prevent panic rather than produce comfort. Martin lay in the bed with his left arm immobilized in a cast that ran from his wrist to above the elbow, his face gray against the white pillow. Helen sat beside him in a molded plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap with the rigid composure of a woman who was holding herself together through posture alone. Ethan stood at the foot of the bed. He hadn't spoken since the emergency room where he had handled the paperwork and insurance questions, and the nurse's queries about allergies and medications, with the efficient calm of a man accustomed to solving problems with his hands and his presence rather than his credentials. Lila sat by the window with Rosie asleep in her lap, the child's face peaceful against her mother's flannel shirt, undisturbed by the weight of what was unfolding around her. Helen looked at her son, the burns on his hands from where he had grabbed the splintering wood to break Martin's fall, the scrape along his forearm, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. This man had caught his father's falling body without hesitation, had shouted a word that demolished a week of careful fiction, had carried Martin to the truck and driven 40 minutes to the nearest hospital with one hand on the wheel and the other holding his father's unbroken hand, saying nothing, because what could be said had not yet been invented. Helen's voice, when it finally came, was stripped of every frequency she had ever used to command a room, persuade a school board, or redirect a wayward student. What remained was the voice of a woman who had run out of strategies. You already knew. Ethan's jaw tightened. Lila told me on day 4. Why didn't you make us leave? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full dense with 8 years of unreturned phone calls and unattended birthdays and a wedding where the groom's mother was absent and a birth announcement that was never acknowledged and a 4-year-old who asked why her grandmother never visited. The silence contained all of this compressed into the space between a son and his mother in a hospital room that carried no trace of anything human. When Ethan spoke, his voice carried no anger. Something worse. Weariness. The fatigue of a man who has been hurt so consistently by the same source that the hurt has become a kind of weather, not a storm that arrives and passes, but a climate he has learned to inhabit. Because I wanted you to choose the truth yourself, and because no matter what you did, you're still my mother. Helen told him everything. The overheard phone call between Catherine and Philip, their voices clinical and proprietary, dividing her assets while she was still breathing. The birthday table with 4 empty chairs, the plan that disguises the buses, Catherine's $20 bill, Philip's security guard, Diana's catering leftovers, and the 5 seconds when recognition almost surfaced before Grant's voice pushed it back underwater. Marcus's threat to call the police. Each confession landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward through the silence. Martin from the bed, his voice carrying the rawness of a man whose body was broken and whose defenses were gone. We were wrong about everything, about you, about Lila, about what matters. Ethan didn't move. His stillness was not composure. It was the held breath of someone deciding whether to let the next sentence out, knowing it would change the temperature of the room irreversibly. Then he released it. You missed Rosie's first word. She said, Mama, right there in the kitchen, standing next to the stove. I called you that night. You picked up. You said you were busy, that you'd call back. His voice fractured along a line that ran deeper than this conversation, deeper than this room, all the way down to the bedrock of a boy who had wanted his mother's attention and received her agenda instead. You never called back. Helen's hands unfolded in her lap. Her fingers gripped each other as if one hand could prevent the other from reaching toward a son who might not want to be reached. You missed Sam being born. 12 hours in that waiting room. I sat there and I wanted. The fracture widened. I wanted someone to tell me everything would be okay, the way parents are supposed to. But you weren't there. You've never been there. Lila shifted Rosie's weight in her lap and spoke with the measured steadiness of a woman who had decided long before this moment exactly where she stood and what she was willing to say. Ethan, look at your mother. He shook his head, not refusal, but the motion of a man trying to keep his balance on ground that was shifting beneath him. Look at her. She has pneumonia because she rode buses across the country with lungs that barely survived chemotherapy. Your father has a broken arm because he climbed onto our roof to help fix something. They lied to us. They were wrong. But they're here. And they nearly destroyed themselves trying to find their way back. Leela paused. Then she added what she had been carrying since day 3, offering it now, like a key to a door that had been locked for 8 years. And there's something else. When Ethan and I first got married, I called you once Helen. Do you remember? Helen went rigid. I called to invite you to the farm, to see the garden. I actually thought you might like the tomatoes. A faint, sad smile crossed Lila's face, the ghost of a hope that had died so long ago it could be remembered without bitterness. You said, thank you, but I don't think we have anything in common. Then you hung up. Helen remembered. The memory surfaced with the visceral specificity of things the mind has tried to bury the afternoon light in her Connecticut living room. The bottle of nail polish on the side table, the phone pressed between her ear and her shoulder, while she painted her left hand with the casual efficiency of a woman managing a minor interruption. She had hung up and forgotten the call within minutes. It had cost her nothing to make. It had cost Lila everything to receive. I cried for 3 days. Lila continued, her voice neither accusatory nor forgiving, but simply factual, a woman presenting evidence without arguing the case. But I decided something. I decided I would not hate you, because hating someone consumes exactly the energy I needed for my family. My grandmother taught me that. Forgiveness isn't saying what someone did was okay. It's deciding you're not going to carry the weight of it anymore. The room reconfigured around this. Helen felt something shift inside her. Not a crack this time, but a collapse, an entire internal structure, giving way the scaffolding of justification and self-righteousness, and the arrogance of a woman who had spent her life believing she knew what was best for everyone. Under the rubble of that collapsed structure lay something she had not looked at in decades. The simple, devastating fact that she had caused pain to people who had done nothing to deserve it, except fail to match the image she had constructed of what her family should look like. There's one more thing, Helen heard herself say, and her voice sounded foreign to her. Smaller, older, more honest than any voice she had used in her professional or personal life. 5 weeks before this trip, I overheard Catherine and Philip on the phone. They were discussing my estate. The house, the investments, the accounts. They were calculating my value in dollars while I was still alive, while I was still recovering from cancer. She looked at Ethan. They talked about you. They said giving you an inheritance would be a waste because you married a woman who raises chickens and wouldn't know what to do with real money. Ethan closed his eyes. The burns on his hands were visible against the white of the hospital blanket he was gripping at the foot of Martin's bed. That's why I did this, not just the birthday, because I heard my children treat me like an asset they were waiting to liquidate. And I needed to know if that was all of them, or just some. The room settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of shock or anger, but the silence that follows an earthquake when the ground has finished moving and the dust is still falling, and everyone is checking to see what survived. Ethan opened his eyes. He looked at Lila. Something passed between them that belonged to the private language of a marriage built on years of honest conversation and mutual trust, a language spoken in glances and half nods and the slight pressure of a hand on an arm. Lila gave an almost imperceptible nod. There's a lot to work through. Ethan's voice was rough but no longer fractured. I'm not going to pretend everything is fine. I'm not going to act like one conversation undoes 8 years. We wouldn't ask you to, but the barn roof still needs finishing. When that arm heals, he looked at Martin. I could use the help if you're willing to stick around long enough. Martin's unbroken hand found Helen's. She felt his fingers close around hers with the tentative pressure of a man making a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. I'd like that. Helen called Catherine from the farmhouse 3 days later. Standing on the porch in borrowed clothes, watching Rosie chase chickens across the yard, with the determined joy of a child who has not yet learned that the world will eventually ask her to stop running. Catherine's voice carried the sharp edge of a woman accustomed to controlling conversations. Mom, where have you been? We've been trying to reach you for weeks. Philip called a meeting about estate planning. We need you and Dad in Boston by the weekend. The estate. Even now, especially now, the reflex toward assets rather than people. Helen watched Rosie corner a Rhode Island red against the garden fence and gently pick it up, cradling it against her chest with the kind of tenderness that cannot be taught, only inherited from a household where tenderness is the default setting. A family meeting is exactly what we need, but it won't be in Boston. It'll be here, Ethan's farm in Millbrook. The silence on Catherine's end carried the specific frequency of disbelief encountering something it cannot categorize. You're at Ethan's. Why would you possibly? Because this is the only door that opened for me. Tell the others Saturday at noon. If they want to discuss family matters, they can come to where the family actually is. She hung up before Catherine could marshal her arguments. It felt like setting down something heavy she had been carrying up a hill for 47 years. Lila cooked from Thursday onward roasted chicken, garden vegetables, fresh bread, 3 kinds of pie. Not to impress, Helen understood this now. Lila cooked the way other people breathed as an expression of identity so fundamental it preceded conscious thought. When Helen offered to help and suggested the meal was more than the guest deserved, Lila's hands kept moving, kneading dough, slicing apples while she answered with the quiet conviction of a woman who had long ago settled the question of who she was and why. I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for Ethan. Whatever happens Saturday, he faces his siblings with his head high. And that means showing them exactly what they have been too blind to see. Ethan spent the morning in the rebuilt section of the barn, organizing tools he had already organized twice. Helen found him there counting nails with the focused attention of a man who needed his hands to be busy while his mind prepared for something his hands couldn't fix. You don't have to stay for this. If it's too much. His jaw set with the resolve of a man who had made a decision and intended to inhabit it fully. I'm done hiding from them. I spent 8 years being the family disappointment. Today they learn the truth about who disappointed who. Helen felt something rise in her chest that she had never directed at this child. Not pride in his achievements, which was the only form of pride she had ever practiced, but pride in his character, which was something she was only now learning to recognize. I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago. I should have said it every day. Ethan's hands went still over the nail bin. You built something real here. A life, a family, a home that actually feels like one. I spent my entire career measuring success in transcripts and test scores, and I carried that into this family like it was wisdom when it was just habit. My best child was the one I understood least. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he set the nails aside and wrapped his arms around his mother, and Helen felt his shoulders shake against hers. Felt her own tears fall onto the sawdust floor of the barn he had built with his own calloused hands. And for the first time in 8 years, she was holding her youngest son. And for the first time in perhaps her entire life, she understood that holding someone was not the same as controlling them. They arrived in a convoy that looked like a luxury car advertisement filmed on the wrong location. Catherine's Mercedes led the procession, followed by Philip's BMW Diana and Grant's Range Rover, and Marcus's Tesla. They emerged onto the dirt of the farmyard one by one, their shoes sinking into honest earth, their expressions cycling through variations of a single theme. This was not where people like them were supposed to be. Diana brushing at her jacket as though the air itself might stain it. What is this place? Helen descended the porch steps. Your brother's home, and you're welcome in it. The farmhouse kitchen was not designed for 9 adults and 2 children, but Lila had extended the table with boards across, sawhorses, and set up folding chairs. And the food covered every surface, the meal of a woman who believed that feeding people was an act of love so fundamental, it required no justification and accepted no refusal. Philip surveyed the spread with unconscious condescension. Did you cook all of this? Leela served with hands that never hesitated. I did, with Helen's help. Marcus, an edge in his voice that he probably mistook for humor. Mom cooks now since when? Helen took the seat at the head of the extended table, a position she occupied not out of authority, but because someone had to be willing to face what was coming. And she had spent her life being that person, even when being that person was the last thing she wanted. Since I learned there's more to life than what I thought I knew. Sit down, eat, then I have something to say. The meal was tense. The siblings asked polite questions about the farm, the children. Ethan's handyman business, their words wrapped in a patronizing gentleness that they had inherited from somewhere, and Helen recognized where with sickening clarity. Rosie, immune to the adult weather system operating above her head, chatted about her chickens and baby Sam, and how Grandma Helen had been teaching her the story about the princess who watched stars from her tower. Catherine's fork paused. Grandma Helen, how long have you been here exactly? Helen set down her fork. She looked around the table at her children. These accomplished, polished, expensively maintained people who carried her name and her genes and apparently her worst qualities. And she began. She told them about the disguises, the buses, the shelters. She told them about Catherine's $20 bill and the 7 minutes on the porch, and the moment when recognition had flickered in her daughter's eyes and died. She told them about Philip's doorman and the security request, and the card with the homeless hotline. She told them about Diana's catering leftovers, and the 5 seconds of looking, and Grant's voice closing the window that Diana's instinct had nearly opened. She told them about Marcus's intercom, and the threat that still echoed in her chest, like something that had not finished breaking. Catherine stood her chair scraping against the floor. This is ridiculous. You can't judge our entire character based on one moment when we didn't recognize you in disguise. That's not fair. Lila's voice cut through the protest with the quiet authority of a woman who had earned the right to speak in this room by opening the door that everyone else had closed. When a stranger came to your door, you showed who you really are. That's not judgment. That's truth. The room contracted. Catherine sat. Helen continued. She told them about the cancer, not the sanitized version they had received through occasional texts and second-hand reports, but the real version, the one that involved hair falling out in the shower and vomiting until her ribs ached, and lying in a treatment chair counting ceiling tiles, while poison dripped into her veins to kill the thing that was trying to kill her. She told them she had called each of them during those 14 months. Catherine once professional and brief. Philip once on Christmas with party noise in the background. Diana by text, a heart emoji. Marcus after 3 weeks of silence asking about the house. Ethan called every week, every single week for 14 months. He never missed. He never asked about the house or the investments or the will. He asked how I was feeling. And when I couldn't answer, he just stayed on the line and let me not answer. She paused, reached into the pocket of the borrowed flannel shirt she was wearing, Lila's shirt, soft from years of washing, smelling of wood smoke and herbs, and withdrew the folded document. This is our updated will. Everything goes to Ethan and Lila. The explosion was instantaneous. Marcus's voice cracked on the word everything, as though the concept itself had broken something in his throat. Philip grabbed the document with the reflexive precision of a lawyer assessing a threat. Diana turned to Grant as though he could fix this the way he fixed quarterly earnings through strategy and leverage, and the application of superior resources to inferior problems. Philip scanning, we'll contest it, diminished capacity, undue influence. Helen let him finish. Then, read it carefully. Independent physicians have confirmed competency. The drafting firm has never met Ethan or Lila. Every legal requirement has been met. You won't win, Philip. Not this one. Diana's makeup tracked with tears she hadn't authorized. You're cutting us out because we didn't recognize you. That's cruel. Helen felt Martine's hand find hers under the table. His grip steadied her for what she needed to say next, the hardest sentence she had ever constructed. Harder than any disciplinary letter or budget presentation or diagnostic conversation with an oncologist, because this one required her to indict herself as thoroughly as she was indicting them. What's cruel is visiting your mother twice in 5 years. What's cruel is calling only when you need a co-signature. What's cruel is letting me sit alone on my birthday because your lives were too important to spare an evening. But none of that is the cruelest thing. She looked at each of them. The cruelest thing is that I made you this way. I taught you that success was the point. I measured you in grades and salaries and the size of your houses. I did that. And you learned it perfectly. You became exactly what I designed you to become: impressive, accomplished, admired, and empty. So when I tell you I'm giving everything to Ethan, I'm not punishing you. I'm correcting the only mistake I still have time to correct. She placed the document on the table between the breadbasket and the pie. Ethan is the only one of you who doesn't need this money. And that is exactly why he'll use it the way it should be used. He'll fix the roof. He'll expand the garden. He'll raise his children in this house. And if any of you ever show up at his door, rich or poor, successful or broken, he will let you in, because that is who he is. That is who Lila taught him to become. That is the person I should have been wise enough to see from the beginning. Philip. We'll contest it. Diminished capacity. Helen. You already said that. The answer hasn't changed. Marcus's voice, stripped of its usual confidence, smaller and more honest than Helen had heard it since he was a teenager. Is there anything we can do? Helen turned to Ethan, who had remained silent through the entire detonation, standing against the kitchen counter with his arms folded and his face unreadable. All eyes followed hers. Ethan looked at his siblings, the people who shared his childhood, who had grown into strangers wearing expensive versions of the same face, who had looked through him for nearly a decade, as though he were a window rather than a wall, something to see past rather than see. My door is open. It's always been open. Not because any of you deserve it, but because that's who I choose to be. He unfolded his arms. But it has to be real. Phone calls, visits, actual interest in our lives, not charity appearances. If you come to this farm, you eat at this table and help with the dishes afterward. If you want to know your niece and nephew, you show up for their birthdays and their bad days and the boring Tuesdays in between. He straightened, not with defiance, but with the quiet authority of a man stating terms he had no intention of negotiating. I'm not interested in a family that only exists on Christmas cards. But if you're willing to be part of a real one, flawed and messy and present, then maybe we start over. Catherine spoke first. Her voice had lost its clinical polish, and what remained underneath was rougher, younger, closer to the girl who had once believed her mother was the strongest person in the world. I didn't know you had children. I didn't know about the cancer, really no. I didn't know anything because I never asked. Philip nodded slowly, his lawyer's architecture cracking along load-bearing walls. I told myself we'd reconnect when things slowed down. The timing was never right because I never made it right. Diana couldn't speak. Her tears had dissolved whatever she had prepared to say, and she sat in the ruins of her composure looking more human than Helen had seen her look in 20 years. Marcus stood, his voice rough, directed at Ethan. Show me the barn, the one Dad helped fix. I want to see what you built. A pause. I've never built anything that would outlast a spreadsheet. The brothers walked out together through the screen door and across the yard. The investment banker in shoes that would never recover from the farmyard mud, and the carpenter in boots that had been built for exactly this ground. Helen watched them go and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tightened for so long she had forgotten it was clenched. Catherine stayed. She sat on the porch with Helen while the afternoon light turned gold and they talked in low voices about things that had calcified between them, the expectations, the pressure, the unspoken contract that Helen had drafted and Catherine had signed before she was old enough to understand its terms. Catherine didn't apologize. Helen didn't ask her to. Apology was a word for later when it could be backed by action rather than spoken into the air to dissolve. Marcus stayed too. He spent the rest of the afternoon in the barn with Ethan, asking questions about farming and carpentry and what it felt like to end a day with physical evidence that you had changed something in the world. His questions were clumsy and earnest and entirely unlike the polished inquiries he deployed in conference rooms. And Ethan answered them with the patience of a man who had been waiting a long time for someone in his family to ask. Diana left with Grant in the Range Rover, promising to call to visit to do better. Whether she would remained an open question, a sentence that ended with a comma rather than a period. Philip left shortly after. He shook Ethan's hand at the door, and the handshake lasted 2 seconds longer than professional courtesy required. And in those 2 seconds, Helen saw something she had never seen in her second child's face, the awareness that he had miscalculated something important, the expression of a man rechecking his figures and finding an error he couldn't account for. When the sun began to set, painting the valley in amber, and Rose Leela called everyone inside for pie, the table was smaller now. Helen Martin with his arm in its cast, Ethan, Lila, Catherine, Marcus, Rosie, and Sam in his high chair. Rosie had fallen asleep in Helen's lap somewhere between the second and third slices, her body warm and trusting against Helen's chest, her breathing steady with the absolute peace of a child who has never been given reason to doubt that the world will hold her. Helen looked down at her granddaughter's face and felt something settle into place inside her, with the specific physical sensation of a bone finding its socket after being dislocated, painful and correct simultaneously. "We're not going back to Connecticut," she announced, her voice quiet but carrying no uncertainty. Martin met her eyes across the table. His nod was the smallest possible movement that still constituted agreement, the gesture of a man who had already known and had been waiting for her to say it. Catherine's fork stopped midway to her mouth. "Where will you live?" Helen looked at Ethan. "There's a cabin on the edge of the property, the old groundskeeper's place." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "That cabin is barely standing." "I know." And for the first time in this story, for the first time perhaps in decades, Helen smiled. Not the controlled, strategic smile of a woman managing an interaction, but the genuine article, the smile of a person who has discovered something worth being happy about in the wreckage of everything she thought she wanted. "I was hoping you'd teach me how to rebuild it." Ethan looked at Lila. Lila's expression carried the calm certainty of a woman who had already made room in her home, in her family, in the generous architecture of her heart for exactly this outcome. Her nod was the mirror of Martin's small and total "yeah." Ethan's face opened into the grin Helen remembered from his childhood. The grin that had preceded disappointment and disapproval, and the long, slow withdrawal of parental approval. The grin she had failed to protect because she hadn't understood it was the most valuable thing he possessed. "Yeah, I can do that." 6 months later, the cabin was finished. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen the size of a generous closet, a living area with a wood-burning stove and a porch that faced east toward the fields where the morning light arrived first. Martin and Ethan had rebuilt it together over 16 weeks of work that began in the cold of late autumn and ended in the first warmth of spring, 16 weeks of sawdust and measuring tape, and the gradual painstaking reconstruction of something more important than a building. Helen stood on that porch now, a cup of coffee, warming hands that no longer trembled. Her last oncology appointment had been clean. The maintenance medication sat in the bathroom cabinet in its own bottle, now no longer hidden in an aspirin container, no longer part of a disguise. The garden she had started along the south side of the cabin was already producing herbs, rosemary and thyme and basil plants that Lila had helped her select, and that she tended each morning with the same attention to detail she had once applied to school budgets and disciplinary files, except that this attention produced something living rather than something filed. Catherine had called twice this month, once to ask about Rosie's favorite color, purple, like everything else in Rosie's world, and once just to talk a 20-minute conversation about nothing in particular. That was Helen understood worth more than every achievement Catherine had ever listed on a curriculum vitae. Marcus had returned to the farm 3 times each visit, longer than the last, each time bringing less of Seattle and taking more of Millbrook back with him, in the mud on his shoes and the sawdust in his hair. Diana's letters arrived weekly, handwritten 4 pages, the words of a woman excavating years of silence with a pen because speaking was still too difficult. Philip had sent a package, Scout's old collar, found in a box in his storage unit, cleaned and wrapped in tissue paper, with a note that read only, "I kept this. I don't know why. Maybe now I do." Not everything was fixed. Some fractures need more than one season to heal, and some may never close entirely, remaining instead as seams in the structure, visible, permanent, but no longer threatening collapse. Helen understood this. She had spent her career in a building full of young people who were in various stages of breaking and mending, and she knew that repair was not the same as restoration. That the rebuilt version of a thing is never identical to the original, but can sometimes, if the work is done honestly and the materials are sound, become something stronger. Ethan crossed the yard from the main house carrying a basket of eggs, still warm from the coop. His stride easy, unhurried, the walk of a man who had arrived at the place he was supposed to be and felt no need to move faster than the morning required. "Leela says breakfast is ready if you want it." "In a minute." Helen gestured to the chair beside her. "Sit with me." He sat. They watched the sun climb, turning the frost on the fields into something that caught the light and held it. "You know." Ethan, after a while, his voice carrying the reflective weight of a man revisiting a landscape he has walked many times and finding new details in familiar ground. "When I was a kid, I used to imagine what it would be like if you were proud of me just for who I was, not for anything I did or didn't do, just for being me. And now." He was quiet. A crow lifted from the oak tree and crossed the brightening sky with slow, deliberate wing beats. "Now I think parents are just people, scared and flawed and doing the best they can with what they know at the time." He looked at her. "You hurt me, Mom, for a long time. But I see you now, really see you. And I think maybe that's enough." Helen felt the burn behind her eyes but didn't fight it. The tears came and she let them come because she had learned in this farmhouse, from this son, from his wife, from a 4-year-old with a stuffed rabbit, she had learned that tears were not weakness. They were evidence, proof that something still worked inside the machinery of a heart she had spent decades trying to automate. "It's more than I deserve, probably." His smile softened the word until it carried no weight at all, only warmth and the grace of a man who had chosen to forgive, not because the offense was small, but because the alternative, carrying it forever, was a burden he refused to let define his life. But that's the thing about family, isn't it? It's not about deserving. It's about choosing to love each other anyway. Rosie came running across the yard, Sam toddling behind her on legs that were still negotiating their terms with gravity, Leela following with the patient stride of a woman who understood that children moved at the speed of discovery and that the only appropriate adult response was to keep them in sight and let them run. Grandma Helen, Lila says the biscuits are ready, and if you don't come now, she's giving yours to the chickens." Helen laughed. The sound surprised her. It came from somewhere she hadn't accessed in years, from below the principal and the planner, and the woman who had mistaken control for love, from the place where the girl she had been before all of that still existed, still capable of delight, still willing to be caught off guard by joy. We'd better go then. Can't let the chickens win. She and Ethan walked toward the farmhouse together. 3 generations converging on a kitchen that smelled of biscuits and coffee and the warmth that a wood-burning stove produces, not the efficient invisible heat of a modern system, but something you could see and hear, something that required feeding and tending, something that gave back exactly what you put into it. Behind them, the sun completed its climb. The valley filled with light. The barn stood solid against the sky, its new timber bright against the weathered posts that had survived the repair. The garden stretched in neat rows, waiting for spring to unlock its potential. The cabin sat at the edge of the property with the settled permanence of something that had always been there, waiting to be found. Not a single piece of it would generate admiration at a professional conference. Not a single photograph of it would produce envy in the people she used to impress. It was ordinary in every measurable way, small, imperfect, held together by labor and love, and the stubborn refusal to let what was broken stay broken. And it was everything. Mom. Ethan held the screen door open, the morning light catching the calluses on his hands. "You coming?" Helen took one last breath of the morning air, cold clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and turned earth and the bread Leela had pulled from the oven. And beneath all of that, something she could not name but recognized the way you recognize a melody you haven't heard since childhood. Familiar and surprising, and exactly right. "I'm coming."